Okay, I think we have Dr. Jamus Lim already here with us. Okay, so what we'll be doing here today is that we are having a post-budget discussion, and with Dr. Jamus Lim is here with us in the Zoom session. Right, it was very nice to say yes to gracing this lesson with his presence. Okay, so maybe if you don't already know, which I'm sure you all know because many of you are his fans, and that's primarily the reason why we are doing this today. Okay, he's the Member of Parliament for Sengkang GRC, and he's an associate professor at Oecd Business School. He was also voted in as the council member of the Economic Society of Singapore. All right, and so let's all have our web cameras turned on to say hi to Dr. Jamus Lim. Let me try to see where my screen went. Oh, it's here. Where is he here?
I'm here, yes. Hi.
Two boxes below. I'm going to make him a speaker. Okay, I'm going to make him a co-host. Okay, hi, Dr. Jamus. We have also some students in the classroom. Do you want to say hi to him?
Hi, guys. Hi, gals. And just call me Jamus, then. No need for a doctor. If someone collapses, there's no way I can prescribe any medication of use.
Okay, right. So everyone is here. So we have a hybrid class ongoing today. There are students both on-site and online, and I think there are some JC1 students crashing the lesson because they want to see you. Yeah, I mean there is one on-site JC1 student that stayed behind after her 4-hour lesson today just to see you. So you're very popular with the students here.
Okay, well, hopefully I will be able to satisfy those high expectations.
Okay, so Jamus, right? So I think what we're going to do, right, is that I'm going to start off with asking you a few questions, which is a follow-up on our lesson last week. Then I'm going to let some students have their chance at asking you some questions as well.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so let me just put this aside. Okay, so the first question that I have, right, is that we actually talked about NIRC, net investment return contributions, right? Which you propose to increase this, right, beyond 50% as an alternative to increasing GST, right? So so I hope you will share your thoughts about this, maybe in a little bit of detail to why you feel that way. Then maybe I'll chime in after you do.
Okay. So let me start off firstly by thanking Eugene and everyone here for taking some time on your Saturday afternoon to spend it with us to talk economics. I'm always happy to talk economics with young people who are interested in the subject or who are maybe not so interested in the subject, but hopefully I can inspire you to understand why economics is such a fascinating part of both both life in general and as well as hopefully your studies in your school. So with regard to the question that Eugene posed about net interest return contributions, let me start by putting a little bit of context. So the idea behind the net interest investment returns contribution is that, as most of us know, the country has what's called a surplus. The surplus was generated as the result of both surpluses that comes from our balance of payments. So our balance of payments is, for simplicity, the difference between what we export versus what we import. And that difference is usually called the balance of payment surplus. In combination with that balance of payment surplus is what's sometimes known as the fiscal surplus. It is the difference between what the government collects in tax revenue versus what they spend in terms of various government programs and expenditures and so on and so forth. So Singapore, due to the foresight of our government as well as previous generations of governments, has accumulated quite a bit of surplus in terms of both its fiscal balance as well as its external balance, the balance of payments. And what this means is that it translates into the need to then take this surplus, and it's like saving. In fact, we call this explicitly national saving, and to put it somewhere where it can be productive, just like what you would do with your own saving. So what the government has chosen to do is to reallocate that across three vehicles. One of these vehicles is our central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Another vehicle is is our two sovereign wealth funds. So one of them is called Temasek. The mandate for Temasek is, at least historically, was to invest relatively more in domestic investments. And then GIC, or Government Investment Corporation, was meant to invest more broadly in international assets. Over time, Temasek and GIC have both evolved to holding a fairly diversified portfolio of assets in real estate, in what we call fixed income or bonds, as well as equities globally. Now, all that surplus, all those surpluses generate returns, interest, if you will, and these returns then either go right back into our reserves in full, in which case that's 100%, it goes right back. And you may have heard this, Eugene probably shared this with you in class, about the power of compound interest. So if you do what's known as reinvest these returns back into your original principal, so that if we started off, say, with $400 billion, if you get a 10% rate of return, that is $4 billion, and you put that back, you are now investing in the second year $404 billion, more, which is obviously $4 billion more than, or excuse me, I said 10%, so that would be $440 billion, and that would be obviously more than your $400 billion that you began with, and then over time that compounds. So that's very attractive. Now, the government, as it turns out, doesn't plow 100% of these investment returns directly back into rebuild kind of into reserves. So what do? Well, the current status quo is that they take 50% of that and they put that into the reserves again. So if for example we earn a 10% return, and so that was $40 billion, $20 billion would go back into reserves, and then the $20 extra billion that goes into our general revenue. So the government has revenue that comes from various sources, including, for instance, land sales and tax receipts, and in this case, the net investment returns contribution, or NIRC. So you put all that together, that is the pool of money that the government can spend for that year. And of course, if they don't spend it all and they generate surpluses, the excess surpluses will once again go back into reserves. So that's a general principle. The government status quo is to use 50%, as I mentioned, so $20 billion of that. And in our view, in my view as well, it's entirely possible for, instead of putting 50%, which is strictly speaking an arbitrary number, you can put instead 40% back into reserves. So instead of putting 20 billion back into reserves, you would put 16 billion back into reserves. And instead, the difference then would be an extra 4 billion. So instead of drawing 20 billion out, you would draw 24 billion, and that would more than make up for the revenue that would be generated by the GST increase of 2 percentage points. So hopefully I've made that a little clear. I know I'm rambled on for a while.
It's okay. Yeah, I think they are quite confused with this concept as well. So I went through this last week, but I'm not too sure if everyone got it. So I hope they understood what you explained as well. But specifically, why do you feel that it's a strong argument to use an increase in the NIRC, right, to supplement what we need in terms of revenue as opposed to raising GST?
So the strength of the argument just ultimately comes down to whether we think that taking part of these investment returns, so remember, we're not saying, let's eat away at our principles. So the 400 billion, to the extent that it's still there, that still exists. What we're saying is, instead of putting 20 billion of what we earned this year back into reserves, why don't we instead put 16 billion, and the extra 4 billion difference would more than make up for an offset in GST. Now, then you have to ask yourself, well, is saving a little bit less for tomorrow preferable to raising taxes today? And the truth is, there isn't a single answer to this. Both are viable solutions. The question is whether you think that the idea of raising taxes is more or less palatable than the idea of saving less for tomorrow. So my belief is that what happens when you raise taxes is that you end up hitting, there are all sorts of taxes, all right? You may be familiar, the most common one being income taxes. Income taxes obviously is what we call progressive, meaning that as you earn more, you will end up paying marginally more taxes as you go along. In the case of GST, however, it is what economists will call a regressive tax, meaning that there isn't a scaling because it's just a flat rate, right? Either it's 7%, or as it will be from the end of this year, it will be 8%, and then the end of next year, it will be 9%. So regardless of what your income is, you will end up paying this fixed share of your salary. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you are relatively wealthy, of course, it doesn't feel pleasant to pay taxes. So that will mean that if you bought, say, a meal, and your meal cost $20, you will end up paying 9% instead of 7% in terms of taxes. Now, that may seem like a small amount, especially if your income is high. But if your income, in contrast, is relatively lower, then the fact that you're paying more in terms of taxes means that you will have a larger proportion of your overall income, which is, to begin with, relatively lower. That larger proportion would hit you harder. So the way that this government has chosen to ameliorate this effect for the lowest 20 to 30% of income earners is that they have decided, well, what we're going to do is we will provide what is known as a Gst Offset Voucher. So it's a voucher worth a certain amount of money. They calculate would be more or less the average amount of GST that households in these particular income brackets would end up paying in GST, and then they refund that to these lower income households. So that's great. So that part is offsets the regressivity of the tax for those lower income groups. But it doesn't offset it if you happen to be someone that just goes past the threshold of low income. So if you're a lower middle income household, many of us come from lower or upper middle income households. And so for us, this tax would be felt more viscerally than if, for instance, it was a tax on just purely income, especially the highest income earners, in which case it would hit the highest income earners more. Or if you're saying that you're saving a little less for the future, then that obviously would also hit us less, because in that case, it just means that you are saving relatively less for the future. So is that the right thing to do? Well, that's where reasonable minds can differ. You can decide, well, I think it's better for us to save more for the future generation. In which case, then you would believe that it's fine for us to raise taxes and to hit the middle classes more today. Alternatively, you may say to yourself, well, I think that it's entirely reasonable that the reserves came from the saving from previous generations, and now they have a greater need for expenditures, and it's only fair that having suffered for so long in their lives, they now get a little bit of a payback, and that payback comes from the fact that they are now getting a little bit more of this NIRC as opposed to saving that for the future generations when what they need is now greater support from the government, having worked so hard all their lives and contributed to these reserves to begin with.
Okay, I don't necessarily disagree with your proposal to raise the NIRC, but actually, I recently saw some data, right? So for the students, you can scan this QR code, right? You can scan this QR code. Let me type the URL in for your convenience. Sorry, can someone read the URL out for me? Z1 slash what? Those of you who managed to scan. Z1 slash after Z1. VIZ. Then DFA. Okay, so basically you can play around with this data, but what basically this data shows is if you look at the US data by generation, right? On average, what we will see that the baby boomers, right, they hold a larger percentage of the US wealth, right, at the same age when millennials, at the same age where maybe they were 35 years old, they were holding a much larger percentage of the total US wealth, right? Which shows that there is actually some level of generational wealth inequality in the US. So I'm wondering whether similar trends, I can't find that data in Singapore, but I'm wondering that if we can actually find similar data in Singapore, that would be a good, strong reasoning for us to raise. Basically meaning to say that it's a lot harder for our generation to accumulate wealth than previous generation because of the different government policies that exist back then versus now.
So, Eugene, with regard to that, we do not, in fact, have that data, at least not publicly released in Singapore. We have some estimates of wealth inequality. For those that are interested in looking at trends across the world, where you can plot something similar to what you see in that chart for many, many other countries, you can type, the URL is very simple. It's just WID, which stands for World Inequality Database, WID.world. And that will get you to a world inequality where you can mess around with this for many, many countries. But the general trend, I think, that you'll see for most countries is that wealth inequality, since about the 1960s onward, had been rising. It actually fell roundabout, and unfortunately, part of the reason why it fell was because there was a lot of wealth destruction as a result of the world wars. So it reached a peak sometime in the 1920s, certainly for many high-income countries. And then that trend started to reverse. And it lowered through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s before it started to rise again. And right now, it is at yet another peak. So for many, many countries. So what that means, and if you were to use other metrics, not precisely the same metric for the case of Singapore, you will see, and this wouldn't surprise many of us that has been paying attention to news reports, is that wealth inequality, in addition to income inequality, has indeed risen in Singapore over time. In fact, if you ask the average man or woman on the street through polls, they will tell you that they have three major concerns. One of them is in terms of cost of living, another one is housing, and then the third one, as it turns out, is rising income and wealth inequality. So even for the average person, they will be able to articulate that this is something that they sense at the back of their minds as a growing concern. So, in fact, one of the other possibilities, other than raising GST for making up this so-called hole that will result from raising GST by 2 percentage points, is to consider the possibility of taxation of assets. So that taxation of assets could happen either in terms of property. This is something that the government has in fact done, but it has done so in what, in my view, is a relatively timid way. It is done so for properties above a certain value, and it increased the tax rate on those properties by just a very marginal amount. It has increased the taxation a lot more aggressively for non-Singaporeans, but in general, the tax increases on property has been very modest. Likewise, you could consider the possibility of a wealth tax. That's a whole different argument for which I had previously advanced in Parliament and made the argument that, in fact, the possibility of taxation of assets is both feasible and, in fact, attractive from the perspective of wanting to reduce this yawning wealth inequality that is emerging in Singapore. Again, reasonable minds can differ. There are some people, not just here, but all over the world, that argue that, well, then you are, in fact, punishing wealth creation and wealth accumulation. And that is certainly one perspective for looking at this phenomenon. Another perspective is to say, well, much of wealth creation did result from the fact that you had an individual that had a better idea, was more hardworking, and so they deserve a certain amount of wealth accumulation. But if you look at the historical trends, you will realize that many people became wealthy also due to a combination of support, sometimes support explicitly from the government. So if you guys have read, for instance, Harry Potter, you will know that J.K. Rowling today, she is one of the most billionaires, but at one point, she was in fact living off welfare from the UK government. And she was able to do so because while she was nurturing her talent, she was unemployed and unable to survive, and it was the largesse of society contributing through the tax contributions that permitted her to succeed. Likewise, many other billionaires would have benefited either directly or indirectly, directly in the form of government grants earlier on in their respective businesses, or indirectly in the form of the fact that they are able to hire highly talented workers to build their company. Why? Because those highly talented workers in the end would have benefited from an educational system, just like you guys, that was partially supported by the government. So if you accept that there was a certain part, and I understand that this is a bit of a philosophical point, but if you accept that part of the success of any entrepreneur, any billionaire, was at least in part because they benefited from the expenditure of government, then it is, in my view, not unreasonable to say, well, since you benefited from that, it is now that you have succeeded, you were lucky, it was a bet, you were both hardworking, had a good idea, and you were lucky. It is reasonable that you therefore contribute back more to society. And so that is the other philosophical angle that you can adopt in saying, well, that's why the wealthy should pay relatively more in taxes.
Okay. The next issue that you spoke up on in Parliament, let me show the slides. right? Which that you were in fact advocating for free public transport for seniors and PWDs, and I think I'm not too sure whether was it you or was it the minister that said that would cost an approximation of $400 million per year. So I'm actually in support of this this thing that you said, right, which is to provide. But I actually in my classes a few years ago, I went a bit further to say that if I was transport minister, one of the things that I'll make free would not be education, would not be healthcare, right? If there was one thing that will make free, would be public transport, right? Because of the significant amount of positive externalities it will bring about, especially in trying to make Singapore car light, right? So maybe can you share a bit of your thoughts to why you actually brought this up? And also, while I agree with the policy, I was thinking that actually there are the one thing that this is definitely a good policy to have. But the only problem I think is opportunity cost, which is that, right, if we were to carve out this extra $400 million, right, could we do something better with this? And I feel that we should spend this $400 million raising birth rates.
So Eugene, I think you raised many relevant points. So for starters, let me say that yes, the $300 or $400 million estimate we provided was from myself. I worked with a team of economists in the background to get these numbers. So it's we'll be the first to admit that it's a very, very rough estimate. We have a very poor sense of what demand might be, but we base it off a reasonable increase in demand, base it off the fact that seniors are already receiving a subsidy. So this is just an amount, the marginal increase in the amount that will offset whatever additional amount of subsidy that they are currently receiving, such that it will be completely free. Now, a few points. One is, well, is this a good expenditure? Well, in your case, Eugene, you have expressed that you felt that this is a good use of the money, but I've had others share with me that they did not think so. There are people who say, well, why should we, just because of someone's age, privilege them in terms of public transportation? Why should they get some special benefit just based on the fact that they're older? My common response to that, separate from the fact that we are an Asian society and we tend to want to venerate our elders, the elderly have a fixed income that they're living off, unlike us as younger individuals who are still earning a living, breathing income. Is much easier to manage with transportation. And the fact that the elderly are just less mobile in general, and so it will really help them when they are not also made to pay and made to choose, in a sense, because for them, what's the alternatives? Well, many of them may not be able to afford private transportation. So the alternative for them is to walk. So it's either that they walk or they choose to take public transportation. Now, separate from all that, the question is, well, is this a reasonable amount to spend? One argument you can make is that, well, it is, because why is it that we even have, to go back to our argument earlier on, reserves to begin with? We have all these reserves in part because of foregone consumption, or what you could even say is excess taxation, because that's what a fiscal surplus is. When you collect more revenue relative to what you spend, that was excess taxation. You're saying that these people who have contributed to the reserves in the past deserve to extract a little bit more from the reserves today because they have contributed to it more in the past. If you're young, you have contributed relatively little to this past accumulation of reserves, and therefore you deserve relatively less. So that's one way to look at it from a pure equity standpoint. Another argument that you could make is that, well, this is nevertheless very costly, and this is in fact what Minister Iswaran, our transport minister, argued. He said that, well, 300 to 400 million may not seem like a lot from the perspective of the overall Ministry of Transport budget. The overall Ministry of Transport budget is large enough. Basically, that 300 to 400 million would be about 3 to 4% of his budget. But he made the argument that a lot of that budget is actually what we call development expenditures. So it's money that is set aside for investment in capital projects and infrastructure, and the variable component of that is much smaller. And if we were to go ahead with this increase, it is essentially saying that we are going to increase our variable expenditures in the Ministry of Transport by about 20 to 30%, which is fair enough. It's a non-trivial amount of money. I've already explained why I think that is reasonable and equitable. We can finance it from other sources. But again, reasonable people can differ in terms of whether they think this is a justified expenditure of money. I'll just add one final point, and that's something that I had explicitly suggested as a middle ground proposal, for which the opportunity cost of providing this scheme would actually be minimized. And that is, if you guys, and in fact, I'm sure when you guys have ridden the buses in the afternoons at 3 in the afternoon, for instance, off-peak hours, and you'll know if you were to ride the buses during off-peak hours, it is that most of the time the buses are pretty empty. You can even get a seat. And my suggestion is that, well, if we don't want to incur additional expenditures because we will be offsetting actual revenue that will be gained, because when an elderly person takes the bus, obviously, if the bus is full, it displaces a full fare paying passenger from it. But if you're running with spare capacity, then your opportunity cost is just a foregone revenue, right? It's just, you're not actually incurring any new costs. There's some very, very small marginal cost from the fact that your bus is now ferrying N+1 instead of N people, because the additional elderly person is now on the bus. So there's a little bit more in terms of the cost in gasoline. But otherwise, it's very, very minimal. You just forego revenue. You don't actually incur any loss in revenue because of the fact that your bus was anyway operating not under full capacity. And for me, I think that's a very, very reasonable compromise solution. Provide free bus rides for seniors who are who would only be able to avail themselves to these free bus rides during peak hour, not off-peak hours. And if they want to ride during peak hours, then they would just have to pay their regular subsidized rate.
Yeah, this part I'm totally in agreement with you. Just one last thing before we let the students have some questions, which is that are you going to speak up about the low birth rates we have and make any policy suggestions on how we can raise the birth rates? Because it's at a very, very, we are like 5th bottom in the world, and that's not a ranking to be proud of.
Yes. We were just discussing this last night. I was having dinner with a number of economist colleagues. The tricky thing about low birth rates, of course, is something that we all recognize, but the solution, as it turns out, is very multifaceted. You may think that it is just a matter of demographics and health, but it's not. It goes far beyond the mandate of any single ministry. Why? Because the notion of raising a child is a long-term commitment. For most people, it's a commitment until they end up finishing, in your case, high school, JC, or university, before they start earning an income and are able to support themselves. So this is a long-term commitment, 21 years on average for most parents. And as many of us know, raising a child is in fact not cheap in Singapore. The fact that you guys are taking tuition is one of the reasons why this is costly, because at least at the moment, our educational system, with the class sizes that they currently are, is such that any single student is generally not able to absorb and get sufficiently individualized attention within the classroom during normal class time. And so they would be required to take supplemental education. In fact, if you look at reports of household expenditures, you will see that supplemental education consumes about $100 in the average Singaporean household expenditure. The average median household income is something in the order of $4,000. So it's $100 out of that $4,000 every month goes towards supplemental education. That's just one component, which is supplemental education. And if you want to provide additional extracurricular activities beyond supplemental education. Something like if you want them to participate in sports programs, if you want them to take on particular skills that go beyond the typical classroom tuition model, then it will be additional expenses. It is expensive if, for instance, you think that raising a child would mean that you would have to ferry your kids to and fro from childcare, from tuition, and from all their different activities. It means a car. And as we know, COE prices being what they have been most recently, owning a car is extremely expensive in Singapore. And so how do we resolve this for a household that has young children and wants very much to have children, but yet has to face all these additional costs? And mind you, all these additional costs don't even take into account one of the most basic considerations that young families face, which is that when they get hitched, when they get married, from the time that they get married till the time that they are able to move into a flat of their own, before generally they're willing to consider starting their family, it's usually still a wait of about 5 to 6 years for a BTO flat. So that length of time in terms of a wait likewise discourages some families from having more children, because you don't want to have a child before you have a place of your own. And even if you did want to have a child, by the time that you got a place of your own, you are starting to hit your late 20s, your early 30s, and then as biology starts to kick in, especially for women, but also for men, what you will find is that the likelihood of actually being able to bear a child also falls as a result of human physiology and biology, and that in turn discourages childbearing. So all that to say, I just gave you 3 examples for why the idea of raising the fertility rate in Singapore is in fact a public policy problem. It's a real public policy problem, but it's a public policy problem that is multi-pronged. So it's not just any single silver bullet will actually resolve this issue. You have to take the entire public policy problem from a holistic perspective.
Okay, so let's have maybe 2 students on site and 2 students online to pose some questions. Anybody want to go on site? Anyone? Okay, we have one. So maybe you can come forward. You can come forward to the class, to the front of the class. And I point the camera to you so that. Yeah, come on. Yeah, come on, and then you can ask. As long as the camera can see you, can already. And the microphone also. Yeah. Yeah, just speak up. Name and school.
Wallace from NJC. You propose that wealth taxes are feasible, but like during the budget, Minister Wong has pointed out that fewer and fewer OECD countries have used wealth taxes. I was wondering why many countries are like dropping the use of wealth taxes.
So thanks for the question, Wallace. And there are a range of reasons for doing so, not least the fact that, and this is a real challenge, a real practical challenge, in that there is the possibility of the fact that people who are wealthy can choose to relocate. For starters, where do people who are wealthy in OECD countries choose to relocate when they're trying to avoid high wealth taxes? They come to places like Singapore. So, in fact, our absence of wealth taxes is part of the problem. So that's just the first point to make. The second point, which Minister Wong also raised during his speech, is that there is a difficulty in valuation, which is why he felt that the government preferred, in general, taxing something that was immobile, like property. I don't personally find it very convincing, not least because I've worked many years in the financial sector and in wealth management, and I'm well aware that the vast majority of wealth these days is generated not from what we traditionally regard as wealth, which is handed down from real estate, but rather a lot of wealth these days is in the form of financial assets, and financial assets are extremely easy to value. In fact, they are being valued every day in public markets. And in fact, we in the wealth taxes proposal that I had, I even allowed for the accommodation such that if, as we all know, stock markets are extremely volatile this year. In fact, to date, stock markets have retreated. If in any given year, your wealth, your net wealth, turns out to have shrunk rather than grown, then you wouldn't pay any wealth taxes. You would have what's known as tax loss harvesting. You can write off your taxes because your net worth actually decreased. But then once your net wealth increases again, then you would pay off your equivalent taxes in that given year based on the fact that your net wealth has increased. And to be quite honest, even in the worst of years, having seen it from the other side, having helped to manage high net wealth from the high net worth individuals, it is very unusual for the net wealth. In fact, the net investment returns for not just an individual, but for not just a country, but in this case for an individual, to actually be anything below the amount of taxes that we are proposing, which is very, very modest, of between 0.5% for those earning above $15 million, all the way up to 2% for those earning, not earning, but with wealth above $1 billion.
Okay, right. Does it answer your question? Okay. Right, so can we have a student who is online? You can raise your hands using the raise hand function, and then let's have you ask Dr. Jamus Lim a question. Any student online would like to ask? There are a bunch of DHS students who are like fangirls of Dr. Jamus, right? You all got a question for him?
I see a question in the chat. Let's see. Can we go more in the depth of how the GST hike might impact economic growth of Singapore today, especially during the pandemic? Should be postponed. So let me just say thank you for the question. You are Ida. So Ida, for starters, the GST hike will not occur right this moment. At the moment, it's scheduled to come into force at the end of this year and the beginning of next year. So it would be folly, there's no doubt about this, for the GST hike to have been instituted in the middle of this year, which is where most people thought initially that the hike would occur, because based on the previous hikes that occurred, so GST was not always 7%. It used to be all the way down as little as 3%, and there have been different hikes in the past. So based on those historical experiences of hiking, the government had typically done the hikes during the middle of the year. And needless to say, with the fragility of GDP as it is, with the uncertainty that comes from a geopolitical strife in Eastern Europe, it will be an absolute disaster to consider the possibility of hiking in the middle of this year. So the first point is that the hike will occur only at the end of this year, and the hike will not be the full 2 percentage points. It will be a graduated hike of just 1%, followed by another 1% the following year. That said, I have posed explicit in Parliament the question of, well, I would like this to be the case. I would like that growth would have strengthen and remain robust by the end of this year. I would like that inflation also would come down by the end of this year. But to the extent that it does not, I had asked Minister Wong, would there be consideration for the possibility of yet a further postponement till economic conditions were to stabilize even more? And he was non-committal, if you will, with that response, but he said, sure, we always consider the possibility, all possibilities on the table. So we'll see how that goes. But at least for me, I would like to maintain maximum flexibility. If a hike were going to come regardless, I would very much prefer it to come in a fashion that would be conditional on the macroeconomic backdrop that currently exists at the time.
Okay. Anybody on site want to ask something? Right, can you come to the front? Can you say your name and the JC that you're from?
I'm Isaac from ACJC. So I can share something like this. Former nominated member of Parliament Kevin Cheng made a Facebook post saying something about your suggestion in Parliament to use land sales as a way to like generate more tax revenue. So you're saying that because the PAP said into the constitution that like 100% of the land sales revenue should go inside reserves. So in theory, like if you by making a suggestion, they could accuse you all of like reading our reserves. However, since like he mentioned that the PAP is like a supermajority in Parliament, they could take the chance to like amend the constitution and say, okay, maybe you can give some flexibility, not say 100% must go into the reserves and NIRC, but maybe could make it a percentage like maybe like 20-80. So maybe 20% we can use it for immediate spending. So I was thinking like, what do you think of that view? But if they think that if let's say if we put the money instead inside the NIRC, then like we could earn more. How about the suggestion of like, let's say we put like 20% of the land sales revenue, like we put inside NIRC, that 100% of it, we can use of the returns from that 30%, we can use it for spending instead of like the regular 50-50 rule. Then I think it's technically two questions. Then the second part will be the carbon tax. I think you also proposed about the carbon tax. But then I was thinking like, I've seen some other people raise the point for it's possible that companies like may just like move to like other less developed countries like with less environmental protection laws. Then instead maybe because like their production processes may be like less efficient, then they end up polluting more. So it's like we have a case of like pollution, but it's like not in our backyard. So it's like it ends up happening worse elsewhere. Then it might be better off to just be in Singapore where we may have greener technology. So although it increase our carbon emissions, it will not be as bad as that if we move it like offshore or overseas. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And your name was Aiden or
Isaac.
Isaac? Okay, thank you, Isaac. Thanks for those questions. So the first question had to do with property taxation and the notion that we will be raiding our reserves. And you suggested that maybe the constitution can be changed, but actually we don't even need to change the constitution. It's not well understood by most people that at the moment, even the manner by which we channel land sales revenue to reserves is somewhat arbitrary. By arbitrary, what I mean is if the land sales is for a lease of 10 years or greater, 100% of that land sales revenue will automatically go into reserves. But if there is land sales that is for a lease period of 9 years or under, it can be up to 9 years. So what's the difference between 9 years and 10 years? I don't know. Well, 1 year, but 9 years, all that revenue actually goes straight into expenditures, into regular revenue, recurrent revenue. So you can immediately see a logical inconsistency, right? If you have 10 years or more, it goes fully 100% into reserves, but 9 years or less, it gets suddenly treated as recurrent revenue. So our argument was, well, to be entirely consistent, logically, what you should do is you say the first 1 to 9 years of any land sales, regardless of the lease duration, should be treated as recurrent revenue, and everything 10 years and thereafter gets treated as reserves. So you put everything beyond that into reserves. It's just the first 9 years that gets treated as recurrent revenue. And well, how do you do that? Because after all, when you sell the land value, it is for 99 years. Actually, there's a way to do that. The naive way would just be to say, oh, divide it by 99 and then take 9 out of 99 of that, 1/11 of that. But that's not actually the right way, because as Eugene probably taught you, there is a value to money. There's a time value for money, which is why what you have to do is you have to apply a discount. In other words, $1 10 years into the future or $1 20 years into the future is worth less than $1 today. So if you were to apply a reasonable discount factor to the stream of income that you will receive for the same amount every year over 99 years, you will see that the ratio of how much the first 9 years would be worth would come up to something like a fifth of the full land sale price. So that was one alternative that we proposed in Parliament, which is to be entirely logically consistent with your very own way of treating land sales. You should take a fifth of all land sales and use, especially that are in excess of 10 years, and use that for recurrent revenue, and then the rest you can put that into reserves. And you don't need any constitutional amendment for that to pass. You just need to think logically and accept the logical framework and of course the framework of modern finance for discounting the time value of something. So that's your first question. Your second question had to do with carbon taxation. And I understand the general principle of what you're saying, which is this law of so-called unintended consequences. We are, by inadvertently raising carbon taxation too high, what we do is we just chase all these activities abroad. Now, for starters, that's not so straightforward. Why? At least in the case of Singapore, most of our carbon taxation comes either from transportation or electricity generation. So these are not like we are manufacturing high carbon emitting processes. There are some sectors that do that. The main one being chemical and petrochemical refining. So that, of course, is something that could be relocated. And in my view, I will argue we want that to be relocated. It's a very 20th century kind of an industry. But separate from that, the other areas are not so easy to relocate. That's the first. The second is whether you think that it is reasonable for us as a country to accept, to signal to the rest of the world, we are a wealthy country. We can afford to discourage carbon emitting technologies in favor of and to discourage that by instituting a much higher tax. And that would put us on, if I may, a moral high ground when it comes to sending a signal to the rest of the world that, hey, even though we know that there's a free rider problem, if we do it, the rest of the world doesn't do it, it doesn't resolve our problem, but we are taking a leadership responsibility in the world. And this is incidentally the kind of leadership that is done by much smaller nations as well. The Scandinavian countries and many OECD countries have decided to raise carbon taxation to levels that are much more in line with what I'm proposing, something in the order of between $70 and $130 Sing, so $100 US. And my view is that is entirely feasible and would put us on a much better position of moral leadership for the environmental question. And the very last point I'll just add is that by actually committing to this kind of action and showing that it is possible, we then are able to resolve a little bit the coordination problem. Ultimately, that's why it is. Many countries don't want to be the first one to institute. If they were to be the one to institute, then you end up having a race to the bottom where other countries end up don't institute, end up absorbing all these polluting industries. What we want is everyone to raise it so that the world is made better off, the future generations are made better off by the absence of carbon that would ultimately lead to an unsustainable increase in planetary temperatures.
I think the government has moved quite considerably and changed its stance in recent years to go towards more carbon taxing, where just a few years back, this was something that they were very, very against, and that was what we taught in our class as well.
Democracy works.
Okay, right. I think maybe we have one last question from Ida, if we could take that question. Ida says, Singapore recently signed an agreement on global minimum corporate tax of 15% that hasn't taken effect yet. You've mentioned there's a need to increase R&D in our budget. Seeing how tax incentive is one important aspect of investment attraction in Singapore, how will this R&D expenditure play a part in countering the global minimum corporate tax hike?
Thank you, Ida. That is, in fact, an excellent question. It's an excellent question not just because, firstly, a recognition of this agreement, this OECD minimum corporate tax agreement, it's called BEPS. BEPS stands for base effect and profit shifting. So it's just an agreement to prevent profit shifting and base shifting among different countries. So it was signed by 140 countries, and it will lead to an appreciable increase in the corporate tax rate to a minimum of 15%. And our effective tax rates at the moment is something much closer to 8 or 9%. And so we will, in fact, just by implementing that, see an increase in our corporate tax take. And when we see that, that is yet another of those channels by which we have argued would generate enough income to offset the GST tax hole. Now, the other reason why your question is excellent is because we also know that R&D credits are, in fact, one of the so-called loopholes that is often applied by countries in order to lower what is known as the effective tax rate. So the tax rate is what you see, right? 15% is what a corporation has to pay. The effective tax rate is what they end up paying after they get rebates. And how do you get these rebates? Well, one of those ways is through R&D credits. If you were to engage in R&D expenditures, you can use that. You can claim it back from the government through credits. And when you do so, your effective tax rate would have fallen from whatever the minimum of 15% is to something lower. Now, what this means, of course, is that in practice, effective tax rates will be lower. This is a loophole, if you will, that is explicitly allowed for by the BEPS agreement. But what is also conveniently useful is that Singapore currently underinvests in R&D. So I would argue that on the whole, reducing the combination of increasing our effective tax rate, even if it doesn't go all the way to 15% because we are giving some of these R&D tax credits, even if we go up to 12% or 13%, that would generate enough additional revenue. But on top of that additional revenue, you are also encouraging companies to engage in more research and development, which as a relatively high income, knowledge intensive economy, Singapore is significantly behind our peer nations such as Korea, such as Israel. So I would say on balance, both of those are very positive policies that we want to encourage and pursue as much as possible. And that's something that I hope will come to pass in the years ahead.
Okay, I think we've taken enough of your time on a Saturday afternoon. I think I speak for all the students that we are all very grateful for your presence today. Maybe we can take a group photo, Zoom group photo together with the students on site as well. I'm going to turn the camera to the class so that we can take a photo with the class. Can all the students on this side of the class come and stand over here so that we can get everybody into the picture? Just for the photo, and then you can go back to your seats.
And do you want those online to just turn on the cameras? If
yeah, can the students online on Zoom turn on your web camera so that we can take the picture together? Yeah, this side so that make sure we can see all of you within the picture. Maybe you all need to be a bit more. Can you all fit into the frame? Can you all fit into the frame? I think we can't get you in. Maybe we'll shift a little bit to inside. Okay, right. So ready? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, trying to. Okay. All right. Okay, go back to your seats.
Thank you. So you'll send this to me, yes? Usually.
Yes, I'll send the recorded video as well of the entire session to you together with the pictures. Let me double check that I've gotten them on my desktop. Yes, it's there. Okay. Oh,
Great. It was nice chatting you guys. Thanks for the questions and all the best. Have a good rest of the weekend and the rest of the school year ahead. I guess your March holidays just ended, unfortunately, but well, you still have the June ones to come.
all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Jamus.
No problem. See you
Bye.
guys. Take care.
Okay, the rest of you need to stay our. We still got 3 more hours to go. Okay, right. So okay, let's see. Give me a minute,